The devil himself could not have made more frightening, vile sounds. An enraged cacophony of growls, yells, and grunts broke the silence of the darkened forest and stirred the very core of my 12-year-old soul. My father and I were rabbit hunting near a creek bottom in the deep pine forest of Newton County in East Texas, and we happened upon something that did not appreciate our being there. With each passing moment, the noisemaker seemed more agitated as it increased the intensity of its furious-sounding cries. Out of sheer curiosity, we pressed closer to see if we could glimpse the noisemaker, but with every step came the feeling of imminent danger. Common sense eventually conquered curiosity, and we headed to more hospitable grounds. That was most likely a very wise idea. Albert Einstein once said the unknown is the most beautiful thing a person can experience, and I won't argue that point. However, after that fateful night, I must say it is also pretty damn frightening. Fast forward 15 years to August 2000. I was tagging along on a Bigfoot sighting investigation in Polk County, Texas, with my friend Bobby Hamilton and my father. A remote camp house had been the site of numerous reports over 2 decades, and a recent alleged brush with a Bigfoot creature had inspired the owner to contact Hamilton's organization. It had been a long night as we sat between a creek bottom and a pine thicket, listening for potential vocalizations. Besides a few bizarre moans heard in the distance, the venture was relatively uneventful. That is until about 4 a.m. We heard a low, gruff grunt coming from a thicket 40 yards to our west. Then the same sound Dad and I heard years ago shattered the previously silent night. The growls, yells, and grunts were back, giving Hamilton, who later related a previous encounter in southeastern Oklahoma, and us a very serious case of deja vu. The noisemaker was a little farther off this time, but seemed equally agitated at our presence. Hamilton and I are pretty good at mimicking noises, so I made a few mock roars at this thing, and if my memory serves me correctly, Bobby did as well. The noisemaker would start with low, gruff grunts and then work itself into a yelling frenzy. It kept this up for several minutes, but opted to retreat through the brush as we shined a large Q-beam flashlight its direction. This encounter did not happen in the deep forest of British Columbia or remote areas in the Cascades. It was in the piney woods of East Texas. This is an excerpt from Bigfoot South, the book, available at bigfootsouth.com. The encounter described in the book and described here convinced the author that he was dealing with a very real phenomenon. He said, quote, "I have heard cougars, black bears, feral hogs, bobcats, owls, and even jaguars, which used to roam Texas, believe it or not. And I have in fact worked with all the world's great cats and many primates in captivity. None of them sounded like this. The closest is the howler monkeys I encountered while on an expedition to Venezuela in 1999. A man who wishes to remain anonymous and go only as Johnny owns a camp just down the road from the site of that encounter. He said one night in the fall, something was yelling out in the woods behind his camp, so he took a flashlight to go investigate and brought along his dog. Apparently, the sound quit when he reached the back of the property and then abruptly started again. At this point, the dog hightailed it back to the house, and the man followed suit. I cannot remember his exact words, but he basically told me that if his chow, which was a guard dog, was that terrified, there was something out there he didn't want to mess with. One story told by 2 different reliable sources also comes from Newton County, Texas, very near the site where the original vocalization described here happened. A man brought his coon hunting dogs out to practice for field trials on a large piece of property in the south end of the county. His dogs picked up the trail of something and took off running. A few minutes later, they came back whimpering, with their tail tucked between their legs. The dogs had never done this before, So he grabbed the lead dog by the collar and drug it over to the spot where they had last barked. This time the dog began to shake, and a, quote, terrible noise sounded in the brush and scared them both off. He said it was like nothing he had encountered in 30 years of coon hunting and caused him to quit hunting these woods altogether. Quote, "You've got something in those woods I don't want to tangle with," he said to the landowners. Once again, going back to the original encounter in the mid-1980s, the beginning of this video. When I heard the noise, I asked my father what exactly we were hearing. He said it might have been one of my uncle's bulls hung up at the barbed wire fence down in the thick creek bottom. I asked him why we didn't go down there and help the bull out. He said, "We're just going to get out of here." I knew at that moment it wasn't a bull. But I was a kid, and I wasn't sure about Bigfoot creatures being in Texas. I wasn't even 100% sure they were in the Pacific Northwest, but I believe they probably were. I harassed my dad for a week or two, and he finally said, "Look, it's probably a black bear." Black bears were at the time still existent in Louisiana, and we were right by the Louisiana border, and occasionally bears would come over into East Texas. In my early 20s, I did a lot of volunteer work at a wildlife sanctuary that had captive black bears, and bears made no noises like we heard. I had mentioned in the 2000 encounter, it had a similar tone to howler monkeys, but it's also very close to some of Ron Morehead's Sierra sounds. Not necessarily the chattering sound or some of the whoops, but some of the low guttural things in there has a very, very similar tone. This isn't, like I said, a whoop or a scream. It is guttural, very intense growling that ended up in a high-pitched scream at the very end. It is not your typical vocalization that you hear online. Have you ever encountered something that had a Sierra Sounds type sound, a guttural growling? Please share in the comments or email this to globalbigfoot@gmail.com. That's globalbigfoot@gmail.com. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel. We'll have more insight on this and other reports throughout East Texas and other parts of North America and the world here at Global Bigfoot.